The NASCAR Cup Series boasts nearly 3,000 races, over 200 winners, and 36 champions across its prominent 75-year history. However, the race that started it remains underexplored. Held on June 19, 1949, in Charlotte, North Carolina, this pioneering event laid the groundwork for 7.5 decades of stock car racing in the United States. Through fascinating characters, interesting storylines, and a significant controversy, the first race was the dawn of a new era in American motorsports. Join me as we dive into NASCAR's first ever Cup Series race. Right before the video starts, make sure you guys subscribe so you never miss a video. I hope you all enjoy it. Anyway, let's get right into it. As we learned in a video a couple of weeks ago talking about NASCAR's first fatalities, NASCAR's first sanctioned series was the Modified Division, or what is now the Will and Modified Tour. The Modified Division began racing in 1948, and the first Cup Series race was held in 1949, and at the time it was called the Strictly Stock Division. Now this was a smart strategic move by Big Bill France, who created this division. He knew fans wanted to see cars race on track that they could drive on the streets. Auto racing in the United States at this time was almost exclusively modified, primarily 1939 Fords. This was because few new cars were produced during and shortly after World War II. Interestingly, this idea of racing stock cars was not France's idea. In 1948, NSCRA's president, a competing auto racing sanctioning body to NASCAR, announced the stock car division first as production ramped up a few years after the war. As far as NASCAR goes, in the long term, the Cup Series would become much larger than the Modified Series. This was partially due to manufacturers really focusing on the series and partnering with the teams to make sure their cars were winning. Having a race-winning car, especially when these cars were mostly stock cars, was a huge selling point to consumers. Manufacturers, drivers, and fans alike loved the idea of racing stock cars, so it was no surprise that the first strictly stock race in 1949 was highly anticipated. Alright, so this is really cool. This is actually the entry blank that drivers filled out for the first strictly stock race in Charlotte that we will be discussing in this video. There's a lot of information we can get out of this. Starting at the top, there was a required benevolent fee of $1.50 per driver and mechanic that used the track. When they signed the fund registration, they were entitled to hospital, medical, or death benefits up to $500. Crazy to think that if you died, your family would get $500 from NASCAR. Under this section, there is a list of 31 permitted mechanical changes. This is crazy to see, especially if you look at the NASCAR rulebook now. Here are some of the ones I found the most interesting. Fuel pickup in the fuel tank may be moved to the right side. Any fuel and oil may be used. Doors must be strapped shut. Use any size wheel or tire. All drivers must have safety belt of good airplane type. A good number of the items on the list are actually just saying what needs to remain stock. So you can see how some mechanics would be able to bend these rules and gain quite the advantage. Item 31 states, any other question, consult stock catalog. So I'm sure the mechanics had more information than what is shown here, but I was unable to find what exactly this was referring to. There's all the information needed to make an entry, and below is a liability form. It also states that mechanical inspections will be made after trials on Thursday and Friday and prior to the race. Inspections were also made after the race, which, as we will see, will play a big factor in the result of the race. Another interesting thing is the purse. The purse was $5,000, and much greater than the rival NSCRA race held in Atlanta on the same day. This was to get all the big names to NASCAR's race. However, the purse was only paid out to the top finishers. Some sources state only the top 15 finishers were paid out, while others state that the top 20 were paid. Regardless, the winner took home $2,000. With 33 cars starting the race, a lot went home empty-handed. So you can see why there were so many drivers who only started a race or two. In the 1949 season, which consisted of only 8 races, There were 113 different drivers. Only 8 drivers, including champion Red Byron, started 6 races. No one ran the full season. As for the vehicles permitted in the race, the only requirements were that they must be American passenger cars manufactured between 1946 and 1949. As a result, 9 manufacturers entered the race. Now the last thing I want to hit on is the track. This is not Charlotte Motor Speedway, but Charlotte Speedway. It was a 3/4 of a mile dirt track that was reported as rough and dusty with deep ruts and bumps. It opened in 1948 and hosted NASCAR modified races in its opening 1948 season. It hosted Cup races up until 1956 and was essentially replaced a few years later with the Charlotte Motor Speedway we know today. It's also interesting to look at the field. It was littered with future Hall of Famers and big names. This included Red Byron, Herb Thomas, Curtis Turner, the Flocks, the Pettys, and a female driver, Sarah Christian. We will talk more about her later in the video, but I find it interesting how female drivers were much more common in NASCAR back then. In fact, at Langhorne that year in 1949, there were 3 female drivers in the field. The fans packed into the short speedway for the first strictly stock race. Some sources state that up to 22,000 fans attended it. According to the track owner's son, David Allison, fans arrived as early as 6 a.m. and cars were parked up to 4 miles away. Only 13,000 of the 22,000 actually paid to get into the event. The estimated 9,000 gate crashers lined hillsides and gates, and there were even reports of them climbing trees to get a glimpse of the action. This was all in order to avoid the $2.50 tickets to legally watch the event. State police were actually called in to control the crowd, which was getting out of hand before the race even began. Bob Flock started on the pole and led the opening few laps, but his engine let go just a few minutes later. Bill Blair took over the lead and led the majority of the 200-lap event. This was before his engine expired with 50 laps to go. This wasn't an anomaly, as the majority of the field failed to finish the race. Although the statuses of most drivers are unclear, AutoWeek reports that only 11 drivers finished the race. As mentioned, this was a rough track, and with the lack of wheel regulations, some drivers actually left the race due to broken wheels. Most of the problems associated with mechanical failures were overheating. After Bill Blair's engine expired, Glenn Dunaway took over the lead and never looked back. He led the last 50 laps and took the checkered flag, 3 laps ahead of second place finisher Jim Roper. But after the race was over, Glenn's car was inspected and he was actually disqualified. This gave the win to Jim Roper. Glenn's car had been modified in the rear end, because it was actually a moonshine hauler that had been strengthened to support loads of illegal moonshine. It was very controversial because NASCAR had performed many inspections on his car and did not say anything until the race was over. Glenn and his car owner were rightfully frustrated and even tried to sue NASCAR over this for $10,000. However, the courts ruled that NASCAR controlled the rules of its races, setting a precedent that continues to this day. When there are controversial fines or penalties, rarely do teams go to actual court, and if they do, they typically lose. As for winner Jim Roper, his engine was torn down for inspection. A local Ford dealership gave Roper a new engine, which was installed in his race car, and then he drove the winning race car back to his home in Kansas. It's interesting how Roper even found out about the race, given it was so far away from his home in Kansas. The race was mentioned in a newspaper comic strip, and Roper saw it. Roper only competed in one more NASCAR Strictly Stock race in his entire career. After his second and final start, he raced locally for about a decade before calling it quits and lived on a farm until he passed away in 2000. So earlier, I said we would talk about Sarah Christian. She was the first woman to make a start in NASCAR's top series. In this race, she finished 14th place. And this wasn't primarily due to attrition. She had top 15 speed in qualifying as well. She posted a 6th place finish at the treacherous Langhorne Speedway later in the season. She impressed a lot. So much so that winner Curtis Turner invited her to Victory Lane to celebrate with him. The next race was even better for her, as she finished 5th place. She is still the only female driver to finish in the top 5 at NASCAR's top level, and did it in the first ever season 75 years ago. Unfortunately, she only made one more start after that 1949 season, and we never got to see her full potential. And she was young at the time, just 30 years old. Between the crowd control issues, inadequately prepared mechanics, and the controversial finish, it was a chaotic way to start NASCAR's premier division. So I want to end this video with a quote from Auto Week because it sums it up perfectly. Looking back, it wasn't the smoothest or most artistic way to start NASCAR's top series, but it was a start, and at the time, that's all that mattered. And that's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, make sure you guys leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Anyway, that's it for me in this video. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.